guys, it's Billingham here reading you another story. I've chosen to read you Roald Dahl's Twits today. It was one of my favourites when I was growing up, and Roald Dahl's got some lovely other stories that you can read. So if you quite like this one, you're bound to like some others that he's written. It's quite a long book, so I'm only going to read you a couple of chapters. But obviously you'll have to tune in again to see if you like it. Okay, so the first chapter is Hairy Faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it's impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be a big as job as when you or I wash our hair. So, what I want to know is, how often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week like us on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to a barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed, or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know. But next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out onto the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these questions. So we're introduced now to Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit is one of those very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, with the exception of his forehead, his eyes and his nose, were covered in thick hair. The stuff even sprouted out of his revolting tufts, out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that this hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand, but in truth he was neither of those things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now at the age of 60 he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it did on most other men's face. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash his bristly, nail brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. That's pretty grim. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough, and nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things, cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go in among the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel, and we quickly look more or less all right again. But the hairy man cannot do that. We can also, if we are careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. But not so the hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into his mouth without leaving some on his hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide as he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there was always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts, lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used those to wipe off with the back of his hand or his sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck in his hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup and fish fingers and minced chicken livers and all those other disgusting things Mr. Twit liked to eat. If you could look closer still, hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen. If you peered deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out all over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand, things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine. How disgusting. Ugh. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never really went hungry, by sticking out his tongue and curling it up sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth. He was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. Now, Mrs. Twit was not much better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. I mean, it was a pity she didn't, because that at any rate would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Oh, yes, anyway. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown on her year upon year as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on their face. And when the person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. So you can see she started off okay because of her ugly thoughts. What does that teach us? A person who has good thoughts never can ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and stick out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. Oh, that's rather nice. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot and walking was painful. But the real reason was she carried a stick so that she could hit things with it, like dogs, cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. I'm going to find out a bit more about that glass eye now. Last chapter. You can play a lot of tricks with the glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again whenever the time suits you. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all of these tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring of hairs all around his mouth. He wiped it with his sleeve and wiped his sleeve on his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so she wouldn't see that he'd taken out her eye. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up of a really nasty trick he could play on his wife that day. "You'd better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you start plotting, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old lady," Mr. Twit said. He went on with his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on his latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught a sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring at him at the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful." So you can see him jumping. Okay, right. We'll stop there. So if you want to know what happens and you want to know why I think it's such a funny book, you'll have to tune in again next time. Okay, stay safe guys. See you soon.